Good morning. I'm Alan Hayes, and I'm the honorary assistant priest at St. Cuthbert's Anglican Church in Oakville. Now, the Anglican Church has a lectionary, which is an order of readings for Scripture for the services of the year. And for the Eucharist on Sunday mornings, there's typically a provision for a reading from the Gospel, a reading from one of the epistles of the New Testament, and a reading from the Old Testament. Now, at St. Cuthbert's, our custom is to read two of those passages, but what I'd like to do now is to read the Old Testament passage, which is appointed for today, which is from the Song of Solomon, also called the Song of Songs, from chapter 2, beginning at the 8th verse. The voice of my beloved. Look, he comes, leaping upon the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Look, there he stands behind our wall, gazing in at the windows, looking through the lattice. My beloved speaks and says to me, "Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. For now the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth, the time of singing has come, and the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree puts forth its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." The word of the Lord. Would you bow your head with me wherever you are? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. There are only 2 Sunday mornings in a 3-year cycle that Anglicans in Canada hear even a few verses of the Song of Solomon, according to our lectionary, so this is a very special day. For comparison, the Book of Lamentations, which is as dour as it sounds, is half as long, but gets read 3 times as often. So it would appear that modern Anglicans find this a largely dispensable book. How things have changed, because until the 18th century in the Christian church, the Song of Solomon, which is also, as I say, called the Song of Songs, was the most important, the most influential, the most commented on book of the Old Testament, second only to the Psalms. And similarly, in Judaism, it was the most important, the most influential, the most commented part of their scriptures, apart from Torah and the Psalms. Rabbi Akiba in the 2nd century said that all scripture is holy, but the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. The most influential of all Eastern Christians, the 3rd century Egyptian named Origen, who was one of the first to write a commentary on the Song of Songs, said that anyone who could truly sing it was truly blessed, but he warned that any Christian trying to scale its heights before they had traversed all the other songs of scripture might find trouble. Every year for 40 years, the students in the introductory course I teach in early Christian history have read Origen's first commentary on the Song of Songs. So why was the Song of Songs considered so important before the 18th century? All it is, to look at it, is a short book of 8 chapters in the Old Testament. It takes the form of a series of love poems between a bride and a groom who are called Solomon as the groom, and a woman has no name in the poem, and is from a place that no one has been able to identify, called Shulam. She's called the Shulamite Woman. Well, the reason it was so important is because it was read as the very heart of the mystery of our relationship with God. In particular, Jews read it as an allegory of the love between God and Israel. And Christians read it as an allegory of the love between Christ and his church. And mystics read it as an allegory of the love between God and the individual soul. In this tradition, it's a song of our passionate longing and desire for God, and reciprocally a song of God's passionate longing and desire for us. A song of our hope in God and our joy, our most holy joy in God and God's hope and joy for us. It was read as an invitation to join with Christ in a union so profound, so luminous, that only sexual union could come close as a comparison. Then in the 18th century, the church got overrun with rationalists, with skeptics, with prudes, and the church fell almost silent about the Song of Songs. Some on the conservative side were embarrassed by its sensuality. That never seemed to bother medieval or Renaissance Christians, but it bothered more modern Christians. And some on the liberal side thought that they just didn't see this book as an allegory. They thought it was just secular love poetry that had found its way into scripture by mistake. And it just doesn't have all that nice, earnest moralism that so many modern Christians gravitate toward. Well, that's where the Anglican Church has left it, but outside the church, the book has begun to come into its own again. There's a raft of new scholarship that's being published on it, both on the text itself and on its huge impact on church history. There are also fresh creative interpretations of it in the visual arts. From the 1960s, there's a cycle of 5 paintings on the Song of Songs by Marc Chagall, and I'm hoping I can let you see one here on the screen. Sometimes this works and sometimes this doesn't. I think this is going to work. This is one of Chagall's presentations of the groom, Solomon, the bride, the Shulamite woman. And you can see just the way it combines lyricism and sacredness and sensuality. The couple are stretching up toward heaven, and they are dominating the little town that they're from and escaping from it, as in the reading that we had. Come away, my love, my fair one. Also in modern culture, it's been used in some music, some movies, in some fiction. I suppose the best known piece of fiction is a book called The Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And this book was singled out in Toni Morrison's citation for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Well, how should we read this? Should we read it? Is it just secular love poetry that got into the Bible by mistake, as so many folks have sort of thought in modern times? Did the church and the synagogue just impose a theological meaning on it that it was never supposed to have? Or can it really shape our identity as Christians? Now, to answer that, I'm going to take a little side trip to talk about my favorite interpreter of Scripture, who's had a great influence on my understanding of the Bible. There are a lot of approaches to Scripture, and I actually don't know anyone besides myself who is a follower of this person. It's kind of unique, and I therefore can't in conscience commend this to you, this approach to you as the one that you should take, but it's one you might want to consider. This person never had a particular interest in theology. He thought that biblical scholars were just about the last people you should listen to if you really wanted to understand the Bible. So you may think he's bonkers. His name was Northrop Frye. And before I came to Canada in 1960, I think that all I knew about Toronto was that Marshall McLuhan and Northrop Frye lived there. Now, in 1968, there actually wasn't a lot to know about Toronto. I've been born here, I'm sorry to say that, but it wasn't the way it is today. Frye was a professor of English literature at Victoria University at the University of Toronto. And by 1960, he had a worldwide reputation, not only as an expert on the poetry of John Milton and William Blake, but also he had revolutionized the world of literary criticism with his book called The Anatomy of Criticism. Some say that he's the greatest humanities scholar that Canada ever produced. And his key principle in interpreting Scripture was that the Bible and classical mythology provide the imaginative framework for all Western literature, certainly through the 17th century, but to a lesser extent even today. Even writers who thought they were just expressing their own thoughts and feelings were working with the stories and visions and themes and structures of the Bible. Right in the middle of our Western cultural heritage, he said, is this huge, sprawling, tactless, inscrutable book. His words, not mine. Now, when Fry began teaching literature at Victoria, he discovered that most of his students knew nothing about the Bible, and therefore they had no ability to understand English literature. So at Victoria University in his day, every literature major was required to take Northrop Frye's course in the Bible and classical mythology. I heard Fry for the first time in about 1969, I think, when he was invited to give a series of lectures at the Faculty of Divinity at McGill University, where I was studying. Later on, when I came to Toronto, I got his permission to sit in on his classes at Victoria College, sitting in the back row in the back of a lot of undergraduates. And when he finally published his book on biblical interpretation in 1982, I made sure to read it. The book was called The Great Code, after a line in William Blake, who called the Bible the code of art. Now, here are three things that I learned from Northrop Frye. First, he said, don't listen to the biblical scholars who tell you to read the Bible as an anthology of different books and to read each book as a patchwork of different sources. That just disintegrates the text. Instead, read it as a totality. Now, that was his advice for reading any literature. Take a poem, for example. Fry said that when you read a poem for the first time, well, of course, you start in the first line and you read through to the last line. But if you really want to understand the poem, you've got to start at the first line and end at the last line over and over and over again until you can grasp the entire poem all at the same time in one moment. You begin to see it as a single structure with all its interconnections. He said that's the way we should read the Bible. You start at the beginning and you read to the end over and over and over again. Now he says in practice, he knows if you start at the beginning and just read, you will get bogged down in the middle of Leviticus. But in theory, that's what you do until you get to the point where you can grasp this whole huge book. Now, not many of us can do that, maybe, but Fry, I think, was able to do that, grasp this huge whole book as a single totality with all those interconnections, like a huge labyrinth where you can go in anywhere and come out anywhere because everything is connected. Read it that way, partly because our elders in the synagogue and the church tell us we should read it that way. But also that's the way Western art read it, as a totality. That's how it created the imaginative structure of Western culture. And partly because if you don't read it that way, you miss the way that it interprets itself. The Bible, more than almost any other book, reflects on itself. And the second thing I learned from him is that he thought that biblical scholars were missing the point when they tried to figure out the historical truth behind the text, like did Dead Sea really part of the Exodus, or where the heck was Mount Sinai, or what happened exactly to Paul on the road to Damascus. Fry just didn't think that was important information. The text was important, not the events behind the text. I said that when African-American slaves in the South sang, "Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go," they weren't interested in ancient Egyptian history, and they didn't need a modern historian to verify the story of the Exodus to know the Bible's power for hope and justice. And a third thing I learned from Fry is that what mainly keeps us from understanding the Bible isn't that the Bible was produced by an unsophisticated culture that we've left in the dust with our wonderful modern knowledge. The problem is that we use language in a different way, and in fact, in a rather limited way. We use language mainly to describe and to report things. The Bible uses it in a much more creative way. It uses it to announce things. It uses it to kind of unlock the magic of words. So for instance, if we read the book of Revelation as a report, then we're going to think that this is predicting a series of events that are going to happen at the end of the age, maybe starting next Tuesday, something that's just turn it into something more prosaic. The way it's meant to be read is a way of, it finds words to point to the inner form and meaning of the world as it is, and all its chaos, all of the chaos that the Lord keeps under control, what we might see if our ego weren't actively protecting us from realizing what is really going on. So this brings me back to the Song of Songs. Is this just secular love poetry, where a man and a woman are expressing their feelings for each other in creative ways? Or is a world of meaning being created? The clue, at least one of the clues for Fry, lies in the very odd metaphors that the king applies to his bride's body. Not many real brides, he thinks, would be flattered by them. Her hair is a flock of goats. Her teeth are sheep. Her skin is like fresh turned soil. Her breasts are like the fruit of palm trees. Her waist is like a heap of wheat. Her nose is like the Tower of Lebanon, which calls a doubtful compliment. So it doesn't seem as if the king in the love poetry is describing a woman. He's describing land. He's describing the land of Israel. So these are serious clues that the king and the Shulamite woman aren't actual individual people, but representative figures. They are the king of Israel and the land of Israel. And this begins to make sense when you connect it with Isaiah chapter 62, because scripture reflects on itself. In Isaiah 62, God says to Israel, "The Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you, the land of Israel." Song of Solomon is love poetry based on that idea that builder of Israel, God, is marrying the land of Israel. So in other words, God is married to the people of God, and this Song of Solomon is about the betrothal. Now, marriage in the Bible, it doesn't just mean that two people make a promise to live together faithfully. It means that two people become one flesh. It's a change in our nature. It's not strictly logical to say that we are both one and two, but it is a solution to the two great problems of human identity. The first great problem of human identity is that each of us is both an individual and a social being. Each of us is, on the one hand, born alone, dies alone, has a unique consciousness in between, but on the other hand, each of us also is claimed by our community, claimed by shaped by our community. So marital union represents the merging of this individual and social. The other great problem of human identity is that each of us is both with God all the time and distant from God all the time. Just as the king and the Shulamite woman are always physically apart from each other, but within view of each other, as in this passage we just read, where the woman is confined in the room and the groom is outside looking in at her, and she can see him looking at him. They're so close and yet not quite there, just as we're so close to God, but not quite there, always longing for each other, always knowing that they will finally join, just as we know that we will finally be joined to God, as we read in 2 Peter, where he says that in the end we will finally participate in the divine nature. So this picture of the relation between the king and the land of Israel leads directly to what Paul says about the marriage of Christ and his church. All of us together, male and female, are called to be the single representative figure, the bride, in the wedding ceremony, marrying Christ, who is the groom, the only true individual, the only one who is entitled to say, "I am." So in this passage in the Song of Psalms that we have heard this morning, try hearing this as an invitation from Christ. He loves us. He addresses us as his fair one. He promises that our desire for God will be satisfied. He invites us to embrace the mystery and passion of our existence. He is so impatient to wrap us up in his arms that he comes bounding over the hills like a gazelle. And from where we are in our little room in which we are confined, well, look, we can see him standing behind the wall, gazing in at us through the windows, through the lattice. He speaks to us and invites us to escape our seclusion, to arise and come away. The worst is over, he assures us. The winter is past. The rain is over and gone. And now the world is being recreated in beauty, with flowers appearing on the earth, the voices of birds breaking out, the vineyards blossoming, the earth fragrant. The time of singing has come to us. Let us arise and come away with Christ our groom. For this vision and this invitation and this assurance, thanks be to God.